Now we're going to talk about the social divisions that existed in Weimar Germany prior to Hitler rising to power that made it easier for the Nazis to take control of the country. So, the first social division we need to talk about, the one you may have already been thinking about, is anti Semitism, which does refer to a hatred or distrust of multiple groups, but for the purposes of discussing Germany in the 1920s and 30s, is going to refer to the mistrust or hatred of Jewish people. So, first, we do need to talk about who the Jews in Germany were, what anti Semitism in Germany looked like before Hitler rose to power, and then we can talk about kind of what the Nazis did to exploit this anti Jewish sentiment in the country. So, first of all, Jews in Germany were a very small percentage of the population, less than 1%, according to the last census that was taken before Hitler came to power. And the Jews in Germany are going to be a very different group of people than the Jews in other parts of Europe, especially like Eastern Europe at this time. Whereas a lot of Jews in countries like Poland or Russia/Soviet Union were very rural, lived in small farming villages, were very conservative, very traditional, very religious. It's almost the exact opposite we're going to see with German Jews. The vast majority lived in big cities, had middle class, white collar jobs, were highly educated. Very few actually even attended synagogue services on a regular basis. Many never went to synagogue at all. And most of the Jews in Germany had very long histories of German citizenship and actually viewed themselves as Germans first, who just happened to be Jewish. Now, that is not how they will be perceived by many Germans, who in fact view Jews as a foreign ethnic group that is invading Germany and whose allegiance is to the Jewish people rather than Germany itself. But, most German Jews felt German through and through. Now, when we talk about anti-Semitism in Germany and this hatred towards this very small group of people, it is important to recognize that this sentiment is very, very, very old. It goes back to the Middle Ages and the dispersal, the diaspora of the Jewish people out of ancient Palestine, the Roman Empire, into other parts of the world, especially Europe. There's a very, very long history in Europe of distrust by Christians towards Jews, of mistreatment of Jews, including many, many incidents of violence and extermination of Jewish communities. So, this is not something Hitler created. This is a continuity in European history. And in many ways, in Germany, this had this feeling had lessened a bit in the 1920s. Now, that's not to say it was not an anti-Semitic society. There were many people who disliked Jews, who would not allow them to join their organizations or clubs. Many people, like I said, who saw them as foreigners. But a lot of Germans, especially Germans who lived in big cities, would have some Jewish friends. They didn't even really think about Jews too much one way or the other. And for a lot of Germans in the 1920s and early 30s, Jews were just their neighbors, their coworkers, their friends. They intermarried with Jews relatively frequently. And so that's an interesting dynamic to this that you have to make sure you remember. Now, one interesting aspect of the anti Jewish ideology that will exist in Germany amongst those who have it is this idea that to be Jewish is to be communist, and to be communist is to be Jewish. It's called Judeo Bolshevism. And it comes from this misunderstanding of the history of communism, which is an ideology founded by a Jew, at least in modern communism, Karl Marx. And it does recognize that many of the first Jews, especially in the Soviet Union, and some of the leading Jews in Germany were communist. I'm sorry, some of the leading communists in Germany were Jews. But of course, not every Jew is communist. Not every communist was Jewish. But that didn't stop a lot of Germans from kind of lumping those two identities together and holding this conspiracy theory that Jews were trying to overthrow German society, German culture, and create this Judeo-Bolshevik communist state. Now, that will be inflamed by several decades before Hitler rises by this fake pamphlet that was created actually by Tsar Nicholas II's government in Russia before that was overthrown by the Soviet Union. And this document is called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it is this fictional pamphlet from the perspective of a cabal or organization of Jewish leaders who are conspiring to control the world. And if this all sounds familiar, there are unfortunately many neo Nazi and white supremacist groups to this day who still refer back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, this is not a document that will be going away, but it was also very influential in the Weimar German culture. So, as we've talked about before, there's many ways that the Nazi Party is going to be exploiting what anti-Semitism does exist in Germany at this time. We've mentioned this before, but it's good to remember that General Ludendorff and President Hindenburg both came up with this stabbed in the back theory to explain why Germany lost World War I, talking about the November criminals in the government who went behind the military's back to surrender to the Allies and ruin Germany because they wanted to destroy it. And they really did stress that the majority of these November criminals were Jewish, that this was a Jewish conspiracy to undermine Germany. And so that conspiracy theory, that resentment is going to have a very strong anti-Semitic component. Not the Nazis will also come along once the Great Depression hits, and they will blame the Jews for a lot of the problems that the German people are experiencing during the Great Depression. It doesn't help, of course, like I said, that a lot of the people who are most hard hit are going to be your blue collar, lower income workers, your farmers, your industrial workers, whereas the Jews, who tended to be white collar, higher income, higher educated, often employed in the government, often, having a decent savings, would still be hit by the Great Depression. But to the very poor of Germany, it would feel like they weren't getting hit quite as hard. So I'm not going to read this. Pause the video to take a minute to read this, but this is an account of anti-Semitic attacks in November 1923 at the very height of the hyperinflation crisis. So this is a great example of how this anti-Semitic attitude will exist even well before the Nazis are powerful enough to have any sort of political power. This is a poster that the Nazis are going to use to help Hitler campaign for the presidential election in 32, insinuating that the people who would vote for Hindenburg are more Jewish, and the people who would vote for Hitler are the real Germans. Hitler, of course, was running against Hindenburg in this presidential election, would lose, but he tried to exploit anti-Semitism to his favor here. Here's another Weimar Germany poster depicting anti-Semitic caricatures or depictions of Jews. What's interesting to me is, of course, at this time, there is this insinuation that Jews and communists are kind of one and the same, but that also doesn't stop the Nazis and other groups from depicting Jews as being your big business overlords, your landlords, your tycoons, your bankers, your really, really rich and wealthy capitalists. Of course, communists and capitalists are competing ideologies or ideas. You could not be both at the same time, but that doesn't really stop anti-Semitic propaganda from depicting Jews as wealthy capitalists and sneaky communists simultaneously. All right, so when we're going to talk about the impact of anti-Semitism on Hitler's rise to power, it really is important to recognize that this is an incredibly difficult factor to measure because, as you may know, just from the world today, People are very bad at evaluating their own level of racial prejudice. Most of us would love to think of ourselves as not being racist, not being bigoted, not being prejudiced. Even, people who are members of neo-Nazi or white supremacist groups will often go on record saying how they're not racist. They just think that different groups should be kept apart and things like that. And so it's difficult for individuals to self evaluate their own levels of anti Semitism. And even more so than that, it's very difficult for people, even if you're going to be honest about your anti Semitism and your hatred of the Jewish people, there's a further layer to this where very few people are willing to be honest about those feelings. And so when you're trying to measure social attitudes or the impact of social attitudes on political power or popularity, this is almost impossible to do because people will not blame or give credit to anti Semitic ideologies, racist, prejudiced ideologies for their support for a particular party or person. They will very rarely say, I support Hitler because I hate Jews and he hates Jews. They might say, I support Hitler because he tells it like it is, or he understands how the world works, or things like that. And so historians looking back, or political scientists looking at the world at the moment, have to try to read between the lines. But of course, that's a very flawed method. So it's really hard to know how many people are voting for Hitler because of his hatred of the Jews, how many people are voting for Hitler despite his hatred for the Jews. And so, if you're going to write an essay about social divisions and talk about anti Semitism, you should really recognize that. That's amazing analysis. What we do know, what you could, credibly speak to, we do have evidence. There is research, psychological, political science research that does suggest scapegoating is effective. If you want to rally people, especially politically, if you want to gain support for people or from people, scapegoating is effective at creating in groups versus out groups. And so it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Hitler blaming the Great Depression, the loss of World War I on the Jewish people, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that was quantifiably objective. We just don't have those data. We do know that anti-Semitism was a big part of Nazi rhetoric prior to them coming to power. Hitler did not hide the fact that he hated the Nazis, but it's also true, I'm sorry, that he hated the Jews. He didn't hate the Nazis. But we also know it was only one part of many. He had a lot of vague economic promises. He had a lot of language about restoring German honor, getting rid of the components of the Treaty of Versailles, getting Germans back to work, feeding people who were hungry. So he didn't hide his anti Semitic rhetoric, but there were other reasons why people could have supported the Nazis. Many people, like I said earlier, before Hitler came to power, already hated the Jews. So it certainly isn't that he created this idea that the Jews were bad or, anti-German or whatever. Lastly, we know from looking at the numbers from the elections from various Reichstag elections that it was really the Great Depression that was a causal factor in the rise for electoral support for the Nazis. So, very low support prior to the Great Depression, that will skyrocket after the Great Depression. So at the very least, these people who in 1932 voted for the Nazis, but did not vote for the Nazis in 1928 or years before, that whatever drew them to the Nazis, they were at the very least willing to engage with the Nazis regardless of their anti Semitism, possibly because of it, but not necessarily.